On the morning of April 26, 1865, Union cavalry surrounded a tobacco barn in Virginia and killed John Wilkes Booth, the man who murdered Abraham Lincoln. Every newspaper in America scrambled to print the story. The manhunt of the century was over. About 16 hours later, in the middle of the Mississippi River, the worst maritime disaster in American history ripped a steamboat apart and killed around 1,800 people. More than the Titanic, and almost nobody noticed. Not then, and if we're honest, not now. There's a decent chance you've never heard the name of the boat. It was called the Sultana, and here's the part that turns this from a tragedy into something closer to a crime. The explosion wasn't bad luck, bought and paid for. With bribes, kickbacks, and a repair job a child could see was a death sentence. 1,800 men died, someone was responsible, and no one, not one person, was ever punished for it. This is the story of how greed killed the survivors of hell, and how history looked the other way. Let's run the clock backward and watch it happen. April 21st, 1865. New Orleans, the Civil War is over. Lee surrendered 12 days ago. And across the South, the gates of the Confederate prison camps are opening. To understand what comes next, you need to understand what came out of those gates. Camps like Andersonville in Georgia and Cahaba in Alabama were, by any honest measure, death factories. Overcrowded pens where Union prisoners starved on scraps and drank from fouled water. At Andersonville, nearly a third of the men who walked in never walked out. The survivors who did were skeletons, some under 100 pounds, weakened by scurvy, dysentery, and exposure. Thousands of these men are now gathered at a parole camp near Vicksburg, Mississippi, waiting for one thing: ride up the river, home, and the United States government will pay to get them there. The rate is about $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer, paid to the steamboat company that carries them. Hold on to that number, $5 a head, roughly $100 in today's money. Because for the rest of this story, every decision that kills these men can be traced back to it. The Sultana, a 2-year-old sidewheel steamboat under Captain J. Cass Mason, leaves New Orleans heading north. Mason is respected on the river, but he's also in financial trouble, and he owns a stake in the boat. Full load of paroled prisoners at Vicksburg isn't a cargo. It's a jackpot. The Sultana's legal capacity, printed right on her certificate, 376 passengers. April 23rd. As the Sultana steams toward Vicksburg, one of her 4 boilers is leaking. Steamboat boiler is a bomb you negotiate with. It holds steam under enormous pressure, and the line between engine and explosion is the integrity of the metal. When the Sultana docks at Vicksburg, a local boilermaker named R.G. Taylor inspects the leak and delivers his verdict. The bulged plate needs to be cut out and replaced. Properly, that means roughly 3 days of work, 3 days, and here's where the money walks in. If the Sultana sits in dry dock for 3 days, the prisoners board some other boat. Captain Mason's jackpot steams away without him. So a deal is struck. Instead of replacing the plate, Taylor is persuaded to hammer a thin patch over the bulge, a piece of metal noticeably thinner than the boiler wall it's reinforcing. Fix takes about a day. Taylor reportedly wants nothing more to do with it beyond that. Boiler that will kill 1,800 men is now wearing a band-aid. Now we come to the part of the story with a villain's name attached. The officer overseeing transport at Vicksburg is Lieutenant Colonel Reuben Hatch, Chief Quartermaster, and Reuben Hatch is, not to put too fine a point on it, one of the most corrupt officers in the Union Army. He had already faced charges earlier in the war for kickback schemes, and survived them, largely because his brother was a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. Powerful connections are a kind of armour, Remember that, because it comes back at the end. Witnesses would later testify to what happened at Vicksburg. Arrangements that steered the human cargo, and the per-head payments toward the Sultana, with allegations of a kickback flowing to those who made it happen. 2 other steamboats sat at the docks that week, capable of taking on passengers. They left nearly empty. The Sultana did not. On April 24th, the loading begins, and it does not stop. 376 is the legal limit. 1,000 men board, then 1,500, then 2,000. Officers on the dock raise concerns. The loading continues. By the time the Sultana backs away from Vicksburg, she is carrying roughly 2,100 paroled prisoners, plus crew and civilian passengers, close to 6 times her legal capacity. The men are packed on to every deck so tightly that the upper decks visibly sag, and the crew shores them up with wooden beams. Men sleep sitting up, shoulder to shoulder, on a floating structure of wood and coal, and 4 pressurized boilers, one of them patched. These men have survived Andersonville. They're crammed, they're exhausted, and they're going home. Some of them sing. April 26th, the Sultana stops at Helena, Arkansas, and a photographer on the riverbank takes a picture. It still exists, and it's chilling. Boat barely visible under the mass of humanity on her decks. Hundreds of faces, packed rail to rail, many with less than 24 hours to live. So many men rush to one side to be in the photo that the boat lists toward the camera. That evening she reaches Memphis, unloads cargo, crosses the river to take on coal, and around 1 in the morning on April 27th pushes north into the dark. And the river itself has become an enemy. The Mississippi is in one of the worst spring floods in memory. Swollen miles, past its banks, fast and barely above freezing. The Sultana isn't fighting a river anymore. She's fighting a cold inland sea, patched boiler, straining against the current, with 6 times too many people aboard. At 2 o'clock in the morning, about 7 miles north of Memphis, the patch gives out. 3 of the 4 boilers let go in a single blast that is heard in Memphis. The explosion tears upward through the heart of the boat, through the decks where men lie sleeping. The smokestacks crash down. Scalding steam and burning coal sweep through the crowd, and within minutes the wreck is a bonfire drifting on a flooded river in the dark. And now the cruelest mathematics of the whole story. The men in the water are prison camp survivors, starved. Many can't swim, most, who can have no strength to fight a freezing flood current. They cling to drowned trees, to dead mules, pieces of the boat, and to each other, which in the panic drags whole clusters of men under. Survivors describe the sound of that river, hundreds of voices in the dark, as the thing they could never forget, one said. The cries faded out like frogs going quiet at dawn. Boats out of Memphis pull roughly 760 people from the water. Hundreds of those are scalded or burned, and many die in the days after. When the counting is done, and the counting was never exact, because no one had kept an honest manifest, the dead numbers somewhere around 1,800. Men who survived the worst prisons of the war, killed on the ride home, some within a day's travel of their families. The Titanic, 47 years later, kill around 1,500, and become the most famous shipwreck on Earth. So why isn't the Sultana? 2 answers. One is timing, the other is power. Neither is innocent. The timing you already know. Booth was killed 16 hours before the explosion. Lincoln was barely in his grave, and the war had just ended. The newspapers were full, the nation was numb, and a disaster on a distant western river. 2,000 miles of bad telegraph from New York slid to the inside pages within days. The dead were also mostly enlisted farm boys from Ohio, Indiana, Tennessee, not famous millionaires like the Titanic's. History, it turns out, keeps better records of the rich. But don't let the timing excuse what happened next, because the second answer is uglier. The army opened investigations. Testimony described the bribery at Vicksburg. Responsibility pointed up the chain, and the chain protected itself. Reuben Hatch, the corrupt quartermaster at the centre of it, simply refused to appear. He ignored summons after summons. By then he was out of the army, and with his political connections no one forced the issue. He never testified. He never faced trial. He died a few years later, untouched. Captain Mason couldn't be punished. The river had already executed him. He died with his boat. And the one officer the army did convict, a captain involved in arranging the transfer, prisoners, had his conviction reviewed and thrown out. The Judge Advocate General concluded he wasn't the truly responsible party. Truly responsible parties, of course, were beyond reach. Final tally: roughly 1,800 dead. Convictions: 0. The river got the last word, in the strangest way. In the years after the war, the Mississippi did what the Mississippi does. It moved. The channel shifted west, and the spot where the Sultana burned and sank became dry land. In 1982, searchers digging in an Arkansas soybean field 2 miles from the modern river found burned timbers and blackened iron about 20 feet down. America's worst shipwreck isn't even underwater anymore. It's under a farm, which feels almost too on the nose. We didn't just forget the Sultana, planted crops over her. The survivors never forgot. For decades they held reunions, telling the story to anyone who'd listen, insisting correctly that greed had killed their friends and that no one had answered for it. The last of them died in the 1930s, still waiting for the country to remember. So consider this video a small payment on that debt. 1,800 men, $5 a head. If you think stories like this shouldn't stay buried, you know what to do. And if you want the next one, a tomb in China that archaeologists are afraid to open. That story's already on the channel.